What if the dollar is not just money, but a tool of power? What if those who print it control not only the economy, but entire countries? The Federal Reserve System is supposedly an independent bank, but who is really behind it? Hidden owners, shadow agreements, money created out of thin air. In this investigation, we will show how the world's main printing press works, and why it is in the hands of those you will never see on television. It all began on Jekyll Island, a remote island off the east coast of Georgia. Today, it is a popular resort destination where families and tourists come to enjoy the beaches and scenery. But at the beginning of the 20th century, a very different group of people arrived here. Those who planned to change the financial system of the United States forever. In November 1910, 7 people representing the elite of the American financial and political establishment gathered secretly on Jekyll Island. Formally, they were going hunting. In reality, they were preparing a coup in the country's economy. The participants in that meeting included Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was closely associated with the Rockefeller dynasty, Paul Warburg, a representative of a European banking family, and employees of major banks such as J.P. Morgan, National City Bank, and First National Bank of New York. All of them were supporters of the idea of creating a centralized banking system that would control the issuance of money, interest rates, and economic policy, but without direct subordination to Congress or the White House. Their plan required complete secrecy. No one was to know that the biggest bankers were joining forces to create a single mechanism for managing the entire U.S. financial system. Why were they hiding? The answer is simple. American society at the beginning of the 20th century viewed banks with distrust. After financial panics, including the crisis of 1907, the people accused bankers of speculation, collusion, and manipulation. Any initiative coming from large financial groups could be perceived as a threat to democracy. Therefore, instead of public hearings, there was a duck trip, and instead of minutes, there were verbal agreements. All participants in the meeting swore not to mention their names and to communicate using code names. Over 6 days on the island, they drafted a bill that would later be called the Federal Reserve Act. This law was supposed to be presented to Congress not as an initiative of bankers, but as a proposal from lawmakers based on the needs of the economy. The draft enshrined the concept of a system of private regional reserve banks united into a single network. This system was formally subordinate to federal structures, but in fact was controlled by an advisory council composed of the same banks that had participated in its creation. Financiers understood that power over money is power over the state. They did not need elections, political slogans, or an army. They needed to create a tool that would allow them to print money, regulate its quantity, and, most importantly, determine who would have access to credit and on what terms. Jekyll Island became a symbol of the beginning of this era. It was here that the idea was born that a central bank could be independent, not from private capital, but from the people. From that moment on, the dollar ceased to be an instrument of a sovereign state and became a product issued in the interests of a select few. Everything was legal. Everything was done according to procedure. But the essence remained the same. In the dark, behind closed doors, one of the most fateful decisions in the history of the global economy was made. This is not mentioned in school textbooks. This story is not popular in federal archives, but it happened. And from that moment on, money ceased to belong to society. After the meeting on Jekyll Island, the process of creating the Federal Reserve System did not stop. It merely took on a new form. The law drafted at the secret conference began to slowly seep into the legal field. However, it was not enough for the bankers to simply write a draft. They needed to implement it in such a way that the public would not understand who was behind the scenes. This is where political theater came into play. Senator Aldridge, upon returning from the island, presented the draft bill to Congress under his own name. The so-called Aldridge Plan was presented as an initiative arising from an analysis of the crisis of 1907 and supposedly aimed at preventing future economic shocks. However, the opposition, mainly from the Democratic Party, saw it as a threat, yet another tool for concentrating power in the hands of the banks. The plan was temporarily rejected, but this was only a delay. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson, a man with an academic background and a reputation as a reformer, won the election. His campaign was backed by the same forces behind the plan: big business on the East Coast. After his election, preparations began for a new version of the law, now without any names or references to private interests. The law was renamed. From then on, it was no longer the Aldridge Plan, but the Federal Reserve Act, a neutral, almost technocratic name. The law was passed in December 1913. It was signed on Christmas Eve, a day when Congress was almost empty. This was done deliberately. There were virtually no opponents of the law left in the chamber. It passed easily, quietly, without any headlines. The next day, the country officially got a new central bank. Only this bank did not belong to the state. The Federal Reserve System was created as a hybrid structure. Formally, it was under the control of Congress, but its shareholders were private banks. The Federal Reserve System in Washington became the central link, and 12 reserve banks scattered across major economic centers became the regional links. These banks were not state-owned. They were managed by boards of directors that included representatives of business and the financial sector. Each bank had the ability to issue so-called Federal Reserve notes, which soon became simply dollars. The state lost direct control over the issuance of money. Instead, it was obliged to borrow money from its own central bank, at interest. Thus, from the moment the law was passed, the United States began to accumulate a debt burden, paying interest on loans created out of thin air. Wilson himself later admitted in his memoirs that he had unwittingly destroyed the country. He realized that he had become a tool in the hands of elites who were acting under the guise of reformers. But it was too late. The Federal Reserve System had begun its work, and it had no intention of stopping. This period became a time of rethinking the concept of power. Whereas previously it had been measured by armies, gold, and votes, now it was measured by financial flows. And those who controlled them no longer needed elections. They had gained a much more secure position, eternal, invisible, but absolutely real. December 1913 was a turning point. The Federal Reserve Act, passed on Christmas Eve, looked like a technical measure. However, it concealed a global transformation of the role of the state in the economy. The central bank created by this law was not state-owned, nor was it entirely private. It became a hybrid in which the functions of sovereignty were in the hands not of persons elected by the people, but of a board of directors formed by private capital. The mechanism was simple and ingenious. The Federal Reserve System did not print money directly. Instead, it issued loans to the Treasury against securities. These obligations became collateral for the issuance of banknotes, the very dollars that subsequently filled the economy. In essence, the state borrowed money from its own independent structure, which it created out of nothing at interest. This was not issuance. It was debt-based financial alchemy. The new system allowed the government to finance its spending without asking the people for approval. Wars, New Deal programs, international adventures, all this became possible thanks to an invisible source of money. The dollar issued by the Federal Reserve was not backed by gold. It was backed by trust and the future of taxpayers. Every banknote printed represented future debt, and the more dollars there were, the higher the national debt grew. Earlier in U.S. history, there had already been central banks. The first was created in the late 18th century, but it lasted only 20 years. The second fell in 1836, when President Andrew Jackson launched a campaign against the banking monopoly, declaring, "I have killed the bank." He believed that a centralized bank was a threat to democracy. But in the 20th century, everything changed. The banks returned. Only this time, they did not come under the banner of democracy, but under the guise of independence. The term Fed independence itself became a mantra. It implied that the central bank should be free from political pressure, but it did not say where this pressure came from or who set the goals. In reality, the Fed began to serve not so much the U.S. economy as the interests of transnational capital. This is its true nature, not to control the market, but to steer it in the right direction. After the creation of the Fed, the relationship between government and business changed dramatically. Previously, finances depended on decisions made by Congress. Now decisions were made behind closed doors, by councils, boards of directors, and committees. Everything looked civilized, but in reality, democracy was bypassed. The Federal Reserve System had the right to influence the key interest rate, manage liquidity, and buy or sell government bonds. In other words, it could influence the price of money. And money is the foundation of everything, from salaries to taxes, from stock markets to inflation. With this power, the Fed became a new invisible government. The masses did not notice this. Newspapers wrote about the victory over chaos. Politicians assured everyone that crises would now be prevented in advance. But those who stood at the origins knew. They had created a mechanism that could not be stopped. It would work, as long as people believed in the dollar. To understand who really controlled the Federal Reserve System, one must look not at official documents, but at the names behind its creation. The entire history of the Fed is a history of dynasties. The Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs, the Kuhns, and the Loebs. These are not just wealthy families. They are the architects of the global financial system, who built it to serve their own interests. Let's start with John Pierpont Morgan, a man whose name became synonymous with power and capital in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He controlled the banking sector, railways, steel, and insurance. His bank was the savior of the financial system during the Panic of 1907. It was he who proved to the elites that a centralized structure was necessary, not for the people, but to preserve their wealth. Then there was the Warburg family. Paul Warburg, who came from Germany, was a theorist of a new banking model. His brother Max Warburg was part of the financial elite of Kaiser's Germany and later collaborated with transnational structures in the Weimar Republic. The Warburgs maintained close ties with the Rothschilds. Their influence was not limited to America. It extended throughout the world. The Rockefellers were oil kings. By the end of the 19th century, their dynasty was so influential that it could determine the economic policy of states. Through their Chase National Bank, they participated in the formation of the reserve and the promotion of the dollar as a global currency. But most importantly, they controlled the elites. Through educational institutions, foundations, and philanthropy, they created an infrastructure of influence. The Kuhns and Loebs were less known to the general public, but no less important. It was a Jewish investment bank based in New York. They financed railways and industry, including through connections with the Rockefellers and Morgans. Their personnel often moved into government and back again. It was a revolving door system, from banks to ministries, from ministries to the Federal Reserve Board. Interestingly, all these families didn't just work together, they married each other. Financial alliances were sealed with blood. It was a caste. Dynasties whose influence didn't depend on elections, crises, or revolutions. Their capital was so huge that they could buy up countries, support wars, and crash markets. The Federal Reserve System was not an end in itself for them, but a tool. With its help, they could direct financial flows where they wanted, support industries where they had an interest, destroy competitors by cutting off their access to cheap credit, influence inflation, the dollar exchange rate, oil and gold prices. At the same time, the Fed remained independent on the surface. But if you look at the composition of its boards, you can see that there have always been people connected to the largest banks, either directly or through funds, boards of directors, or lobbying structures. Even a change of presidents made little difference. The real decisions were made in rooms where the press was not allowed. Even today, you can see that the largest banks, such as Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Citigroup, all have alumni in key economic departments, and vice versa. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is an institutional fact. Money loves silence, and it is in this silence that real power is formed. By the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, an economic boom, and a crisis. And in all these events, the Federal Reserve System played a key role. Despite its professed independence, the Fed actively intervened in the economy. And each time, those closest to the source of money came out on top. The First World War was the first major test for the new system. The state needed enormous funds for mobilization, armaments, and aid to its allies. Thanks to the Fed, money was quickly found. The central bank bought up treasury bonds, thereby creating money out of debt obligations. The result was a sharp increase in debt, inflation, and the richest defense contractors. The people paid with their taxes and their lives. The banks received interest. The Second World War surpassed the first in scale. The Fed again became actively involved. A maximum interest rate was set, controlled by the central bank. The government went into debt again, and the Fed printed money, but no longer backed by gold, but by the promise of victory. Money flowed like water, once again into the pockets of those who controlled the military industry, the banking sector, and logistics. After the war, the United States was the only country with an intact economy. The dollar became the global reserve currency. Contrary to popular belief, the Fed did not save the economy during the Great Depression. On the contrary, it made it worse. In the 1930s, after the stock market crash, the Fed reduced the money supply, failed to intervene in a timely manner, and thus allowed the crisis to develop. Millions lost their jobs and homes, But the largest corporations bought up assets for a song. Capital once again ended up in the same hands. An invisible redistribution of wealth. In the 1970s, the gold standard was finally abolished. Before that, the dollar still had a nominal backing in gold. But in 1971, President Nixon finally decoupled the currency from the metal. This meant that money was now just a promise. It could be printed in unlimited quantities, and it was printed without restrictions. The Federal Reserve became more than just a regulator. It turned into a production facility for the world currency. Every financial crisis, whether in 1987, 2000, or 2008, followed the same script. The Federal Reserve intervened, bailed out banks, and printed trillions more. But millions of people lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings. Time and again, the state saved corporations, not citizens. Why? Because the Fed's model is such that the more debt there is, the more profit there is. The central bank does not live off taxation, but off debt management. The more crises there are, the more reasons there are for intervention. The more intervention, the greater the economy's dependence on liquidity injections. The economy has become an addict, and the Fed is the dealer. This system does not work by accident. It has been built over decades. It has survived presidents, wars, and ideological changes. And each time, its real beneficiaries remained in the shadows, making fortunes regardless of the outcome. They lost only in one case, if confidence in the dollar collapsed. That is why they supported faith in the system at any cost, through the media, textbooks, expert commentary. The Fed is not just a bank. It is the center of economic control, and its tools are far from limited to interest rates or the printing press. It is a center of power, and every crisis is not a threat to it, but an opportunity to strengthen its influence. For most people, the idea that the state does not control its own currency sounds absurd. After all, isn't it the government that issues money? Isn't it the government that determines economic policy? On paper, yes, but in reality, things are different. The Federal Reserve System is not an agency subordinate to the President or Congress. It is an independent entity with the power to create money, and it is not directly accountable to the electorate. When the average person thinks about money, they imagine a paper dollar or a number in a bank account. They are confident that the government is behind it. However, if you dig deeper, it becomes clear that the Fed does not just create money. It determines how much of that money will be in the economy, who will get it, and under what conditions. Most importantly, it decides when there will be less money. This means that economic cycles, crises, and recovery can all be triggered at the push of a button. For example, raising the key interest rate makes borrowing more expensive. Companies start cutting costs and laying off employees. People spend less, and unemployment rises. But inflation falls. This is no accident. It is a tool. Interest rate management is a lever of power that can trigger recession or growth. Who decides when to raise rates? The Open Market Committee is a body within the Fed that is not elected by the people, is not accountable to the president, and is made up of representatives of reserve banks and the Board of Governors. And although the president appoints the members of the board and the Senate confirms them, the real power remains within the system, where ties to Wall Street have always been closer than to the voters. In times of crisis, the role of the Fed becomes particularly visible. The crisis of 2008 is a prime example. When the mortgage market collapsed, millions of people lost their homes. But what did the Fed do? It bailed out the banks by buying up their bad assets with public money. In essence, the debts were transferred to taxpayers. The banks received new liquidity and continued to receive bonuses. This mechanism was called too big to fail. In other words, if a bank is large enough, it cannot be allowed to go bankrupt. Otherwise, the entire system will collapse. But who made them so big? The same people who wrote the rules. The same people who determined who would get the money in the next crisis. And every time, the pattern repeated itself. Private profits, public losses. Interestingly, the entire architecture of the Federal Reserve is designed to create the appearance of balance. Formally, each reserve bank has its own charter and territorial jurisdiction. But in reality, they are all bound by a common policy dictated from the center. Consolidating power while maintaining the illusion of decentralization is a classic management scheme. This arrangement allows not only control over the economy, but also avoidance of responsibility. When crises occur, politicians can wash their hands of it. We have no influence over the Fed's decisions. When things are going well, they can take credit for themselves. This makes the Federal Reserve System the perfect scapegoat and, at the same time, a universal lever of influence. Understanding that the state does not own money is the first step towards understanding the real structure of power. Because whoever prints money does not just control the economy. They control everything: medicine, education, politics, the media. Money is the oxygen of the system, and whoever controls that oxygen decides who will breathe and who will suffocate. When people talk about power in the world, they think of presidents, prime ministers, party leaders. But real power is much quieter and more invisible. It hides behind formulas, graphs, and reports. It speaks not in slogans, but in interest rates. It is in the hands of those who control the money supply. And this is precisely what makes the Federal Reserve System a key mechanism of world power, operating outside the framework of democracy. Since its inception, the Fed has been given the right not only to regulate the U.S. economy, but also to indirectly influence the entire world. Why? Because the dollar has become the world's reserve currency. Most international transactions, trade contracts, and payments for oil and resources are conducted in dollars. This means that control over the dollar is control over world trade. This situation did not arise by accident. After World War II, at the Bretton Woods Conference, a decision was made to create a new global financial architecture. The dollar was established as the main currency, equating it to gold. And when Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold in 1971, nothing changed. It was just that now the dollar was not backed by gold or any guarantee. All that remained was faith. And this faith was supported not by the economy, but by force. The United States became the center of global currency issuance. This allowed it to finance wars, political projects, and economic programs outside its territory, without deficit, without the approval of international organizations, simply by turning on the printing press. And the rest of the world was forced to use these dollars because without them, it was impossible to buy oil, trade, or invest. In this way, the Federal Reserve gained the unique ability to export inflation. When the United States prints more money, that money first goes abroad, where it settles in the reserves of other countries. This leads to price increases around the world, but not immediately in the United States itself. Developing economies are the first to feel the impact. Price increases, currency devaluation, capital flight. And once again, those closest to the center of issuance are the winners. In such a system, it does not matter who is formally in power. Presidents may come and go, parties may rise and fall. But as long as the Fed mechanism is in place, the course remains the same. Because the system is not designed for the people, but for capital. Managing the economy through the money supply has become the main policy tool. There is no longer any need to start wars. It is enough to restrict liquidity. The Fed's influence extends far beyond the economy. It sets the agenda. Through lending, it shapes the sectors that grow or die. Through stimulus programs, it raises some companies and kills others. Through the liquidity base, it creates the illusion of growth. The entire modern economy, from stock markets to startups, depends on the flows coming from the Fed. This power is not loud, it is not flashy, but it is absolute. When a single body can regulate the value of money for 7 billion people, it is no longer a financial institution. It is a global arbiter. And like any arbiter, it is not necessarily impartial. That is why many experts, even those not prone to conspiracy theories, say that the Fed is not just a bank. It is a geopolitical tool disguised as an economic regulator. And as long as the whole world is tied to the dollar, the Fed has the ability to press buttons that trigger crises, reforms, riots, and maintain global order without firing a single shot. If the dollar is the global currency, then the Federal Reserve System becomes not just a national bank, but the heart of the world financial system. With each passing decade, its influence has only expanded. However, the risks have grown along with it. A world built on a single currency becomes hostage to its stability. And stability, in turn, depends on those who control that currency. It is not surprising that in recent years, questions have increasingly been asked. Can such a monopolistic center be trusted? One of the Fed's key tools in the global game is its quantitative easing program. After the crisis of 2008, it began buying trillions of dollars worth of bonds and other securities from the market. This created the illusion of recovery. Money flowed into the financial system, stock markets rose, and startups took off. But the real economy often did not receive this money. It settled in assets, exacerbating inequality and the gap between the financial elite and the rest of society. This gave rise to a new phenomenon, the bubble economy. Inflation was low, but asset prices were rising. Real estate, stocks, cryptocurrencies, all of these rose not because of their fundamental value, but thanks to liquidity flows. And these flows were directed by the Fed. It became a center for distributing illusions. Illusions of growth, progress, sustainability. However, every bubble eventually bursts. The only question is who will be the first to get out. Those who have information can get out. Those who are close to the regulator. Those who know when the wind will change. And every time, the same circle wins. The rest pay. The digital transformation of the economy has not bypassed the Federal Reserve either. The introduction of a digital dollar, CBDC, has been under discussion for several years. The idea is to create an electronic currency controlled directly by the central bank. At first glance, it seems convenient, fast, secure, modern. But in reality, it is a threat to privacy and absolute control. After all, a digital dollar could be not just a means of payment, but also a means of surveillance. The system would be able to see every transaction, control access to money, and block accounts on command. The Fed does not comment on these risks. It talks about the future of innovation, competition with cryptocurrencies, and stability. But public organizations and digital rights activists are already sounding the alarm. In the hands of a centralized authority, such a tool could turn money into an instrument of subjugation. In addition, the Fed's role in international politics is becoming increasingly clear. Sanctions, restrictions, asset freezes, all this is happening not through the army, but through the financial system. Not only government accounts are being frozen, but also those of private individuals. And again, it is not a court that decides, but an algorithm. Not parliament, but a cabinet of officials who are appointed, not elected. In this way, the Fed is transforming from a regulator into a supranational structure. It can strengthen countries and bring them down. It can create money and devalue it. And it does so not for the sake of the people, but to preserve its own power structure. The question today is no longer who prints money. The question is who controls access to it. And this access is increasingly becoming a privilege rather than a right. In such a system, democracy becomes a simulation, and freedom becomes a credit limit. By the middle of the 21st century, the mechanisms of influence created by the Federal Reserve System had become not only economic, but also technological. The era of digital transformation has given the Fed new tools of control that the founders of the system could not even dream of. With digital platforms, algorithms, and artificial intelligence, the central bank has gained not only the ability to print money, but also to influence behavior, predict consumption, and anticipate riots. One of the new vectors is big data analysis. Now, the Fed can see in real time how people are spending their money, which categories of goods are growing and which are falling. This data is not just statistics. It is a management tool. It can be used to understand where to distribute benefits to avoid unrest, where to raise rates to slow inflation, where to inject liquidity to boost the market. The economy has become a chessboard, and the population has become variables. Moreover, cooperation with major IT companies gives the Fed access to behavioral models. Who is searching? Who is postponing purchases? Who is going into cash? These models make it possible to predict financial panics in advance and manage them. The psychology of mass behavior is becoming as important a tool as the refinancing rate. As physical money disappears, the Fed's influence becomes total. The banking system is no longer just an intermediary. It is an extension of the central brain. At any moment, transactions can be frozen, limits changed, negative rates introduced. Money no longer belongs to its owner. It is rented from the system. Technology provides opportunities, but also vulnerabilities. The more control there is, the higher the risk of external interference. Therefore, in parallel with the strengthening of digital tools, the Fed is actively engaged in cybersecurity. Backup data centers are being built, cryptographic systems are being tested, and scenarios for disconnecting from the global network in the event of a crisis are being developed. This is because power is not only about control over the dollar, but also over the infrastructure through which it moves. One of the most controversial initiatives is social credit, which is still unofficial. The idea is to combine financial and behavioral information into a single profile. Solvency, credit history, internet activity, and behavior on social media could all become the basis for a trust rating. Such a model already exists in China, but is now being discussed in Western institutions, including in the corridors of central banks. Critics call it a digital concentration camp. Defenders call it a step towards a sustainable society. But the fact remains, A centralized body that controls both money and data gains unlimited power. This is not just a regulator, it is a new form of government. Silent, unelected, but omnipresent. The scariest thing is getting used to it. When generations grow up in a system where control is the norm, where account freezing is not an exception, but a precautionary measure, where uncontrollable forms of money are outlawed, where an undesirable user is a threat to stability. The Fed is not standing still. Its structure adapts to each new round of technological evolution. Once a mere club of bankers, it is now the architectural center of the entire Western financial world. And with each passing year, it becomes less dependent on elections and more dependent on algorithms. This is no longer the power of the people. This is the power of formulas. The Federal Reserve System is more than just a bank. It is not an institution that can be changed like a president or a congressman. It is the foundation of the modern global economy. But behind its architecture lies a simple, frightening question. Who really benefits from its existence? The answer is not obvious. The Fed does not publish a list of its shareholders in the conventional sense. Formally, it is a network of 12 regional banks, each of which has shares owned by private banks. And although the state has supervisory functions, the real influence remains with the financial corporations that have invested in these structures. For example, the largest U.S. banks, such as J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Bank of America, have shares in regional reserve banks. This gives them not only dividends, but also the opportunity to participate in the selection of board members. And that means they have a say in policy-making. This is the hidden architecture of power. Rules that affect billions of people are formed through councils, committees, and technical documents. This system is no accident. It has been built over more than a century. It has survived wars, crises, and reforms. And each time, it has emerged stronger. Because at its core is not ideology, but mathematics. It is not subject to emotions and does not require slogans. It grows on its own, like a network, through derivatives, credit lines, and investment flows. And every step it takes strengthens it. When people say that the dollar is a weapon, they are not exaggerating. It can be used to sanction, destroy economies, and change political regimes. But even more important is managing fear. Fear of devaluation, default, being cut off from SWIFT. These are tools of influence that are far more effective than tanks. Because they work silently, without blood, but with the same result. It is interesting that as the Fed's influence grows, so does distrust of it. Alternative currencies, digital projects, and the crypto economy are emerging. People are beginning to understand that a system built on debt and interest will sooner or later reach a dead end, because its growth is not infinite. And then the main question arises: does the world have a plan B? So far, no. The world is still held together by the dollar. It remains a measure of value, a global exchange equivalent, and a pillar of the stock markets. But more and more countries, companies, and even individuals are looking for a way out, an alternative. And this is not just an economic gesture. It is political and cultural resistance. The true owners of the Federal Reserve will never appear in the newspapers. They do not give interviews. They do not participate in elections. Their power lies in the fact that no one sees it. It does not require a title. It is built into formulas, mechanisms, and code. And that makes it virtually invulnerable. But any system built on secrecy will eventually face those who ask questions. And the more people begin to understand how reality works, the harder it is to maintain the illusion. Perhaps the Fed will not collapse. Perhaps it will transform. But it is important to understand that money is not a neutral tool. It is a form of power. And as long as that power remains nameless, society remains subjugated. Knowledge is the first step towards freedom. And if this story has allowed even one person to see the mechanism behind the curtain, then it has not been in vain.